about all of the different myths that we cherish. And I have altogether about 25 different myths in the book that are described, and then I attempt to explode the various myths. And one of those myths is that there is truth in labeling. And as I point out in the book, if you really examine many of the labels on products that we use, most people every day, you'll find a whole variety of generic terms such as natural or fragrances or the word inert, which basically is supposed to mean that, yes, the chemicals are placed in there by manufacturers, but they don't really do anything. Well, of course the chemicals do something, but the term inert is a legal way for manufacturers, and this includes food processors, but also the manufacturers of various consumer products that contain chemicals. It's a legal way for them to avoid revealing to the public the identity of the whole variety of mixtures of synthetic chemicals that go into these foods and medicines and, of course, consumer products. And it's all under trade secrecy law, as it's known, and trade secrecy law was originally intended to protect the intellectual property rights of manufacturers from their competitors. But we've reached a time in this day and age where most of the major manufacturers, the corporations, can afford, they have the resources and they also have the technology to reverse engineer the ingredients of any competitor's products. So they're not really keeping the identity of these chemicals from competitors. They're keeping the identity from consumers, those of us who deserve to know.
Yeah, right. But this is all approved, I guess, corporate law. Our government says that's fine. Food and Drug says that's fine.
Yes, and no one is really challenging it, like in Congress or in any sort of way, from the standpoint of common sense, who is really benefiting from the secrecy? Well, it's the corporations, the manufacturers that are using chemicals that might raise red flags with some of us, and especially from the standpoint of the mixtures of all of these different chemicals together in our products. If we knew all of that, we might start asking questions about proper testing of all of these chemicals.
And that was my next question. I guess these things haven't really been tested.
Well, that's another one of the myths that I looked at in this book. Does the government, for instance, really know what is safe?
Well, it's sort of like the cosmetic industry. They're changing their laws and bylaws and guidelines. Food and Drug is that for a very long time they didn't even have to list ingredients.
Right, and there are, I think the latest estimate is more than 25,000 different chemicals in cosmetics and personal care products.
Which affects your largest organ.
Yes.
Your skin.
Yes.
And they don't have to reveal that.
Under the law, under the Food and Drug Administration regulations, the cosmetics manufacturers do not have to put any rigorous testing on any of these chemicals. That's one of the big loopholes. And fortunately, there have been some groups in connection with breast cancer in particular, because there have been some links drawn between some of the personal care product chemicals and the possibility of breast cancer resulting. And
yeah, that has been one of my concerns too, and people ask me about that. And if anybody's interested, call me later. I have a solution for you. But if I may, one of your myths you have here listed is ancient remedies are unscientific. And
right, we've relied upon animal studies for decades now, to the extent that any testing is done whatsoever. And most of the animal study tests have been done not in connection with consumer products or cosmetics, or even in connection with food. It's been done in connection with pharmaceutical drugs. And even looking at the animal testing as the foundation for our public health standards, there are lots of fundamental flaws. For instance, there have been dozens and dozens of examples of pharmaceutical drugs that were approved based on no harm being seen in the animals that were tested. But once those drugs were in the marketplace, and Vioxx is a good recent example, then suddenly humans began to sicken and die and suffer body organ failure, etc. And the reason was that while these chemicals were not toxic to animals, they were toxic to humans. It works the other way, too. Sometimes chemicals and drugs that are toxic to animals might not be, in the short term, toxic to humans. Aspirin is an example that springs to mind. If aspirin were going through the approval process of the Food and Drug Administration today, and if the different species of animals used to test chemicals were used for aspirin, aspirin is toxic to many species of animals. They would sicken and die, and so aspirin wouldn't be approved to go into the marketplace as a result. Well, of course, then we ask ourselves, well, if animal studies have been used, to whatever extent there's been testing, to show one way or the other whether or not a chemical was safe, and animal studies are useless, what do we really have as an institution to depend on? And that's the case I make in the book. We can't really depend upon government regulatory agencies. We can't depend upon manufacturers. And we can't even depend upon medical science. Ultimately, we are all guinea pigs in a vast chemical experiment.
This is true because even your doctor or your pharmacist, when you're taking more than one prescription medicine, that's 100 times 100 chemical changes, and they don't know where that is. You're like a big combination lock. It could be anything.
Yes.
So that is the problem. Well, since we were talking about animal testing, the pet food industry then, I guess that's not safe either.
Well, I have a section on the myth that pet food is harmless. Pet food contains many of the same synthetic chemicals that go into processed foods for humans. And I interviewed a number of veterinarians who have been veterinarians for 4 and 5 decades, who were talking about how during the period that they have been in veterinary work, they have seen the same sorts of illnesses and diseases occurring in animals that have been occurring in humans, that the immune systems of animals are being affected by the chemicals in the pet foods that they are consuming. And so there's a parallel there in the animal kingdom of what we're doing to our pets. You see the fur falling out sometimes in the case of a certain animal species as a result of the colorings and preservatives that go into animal food. Well, quite often, the colorings, for instance, that go into animal food, it's not to make the food more appealing to the animals. The animals generally don't care. It's the smell that matters to them. It's the color of the animal foods to make it more appealing to humans.
Yeah,